Hi, this is Danny Doyle, and earlier this week I made a sort of shitposty tier list, which was tiering the Path of Radiance cast and how they performed in my charity stream, which was a sabotage stream, and so things were very different from how the order would be in a vanilla playthrough. And so I thought it would also be fun to sort of get out the way what I think an actual Path of Radiance tier list looks like. So I've gone ahead and built one. I do want to talk about the sort of qualifications for this tier list because, you know, every tier list is going to have a different set of what we're evaluating units on. I am assuming that this is being played on hard mode, which is the highest difficulty available in the international release of Path of Radiance. Maddening mode was a Japanese-only difficulty mode, and a couple of units might move around ever so slightly, but I've only ever completed one playthrough of Maniac mode, so I don't know that I have the expertise to talk about Maniac mode, and I also think that most people's experience with Path of Radiance will be on the international version, at which point the highest available difficulty is hard mode, so that's what I'm going to be evaluating it on. I am including bonus experience as an option, as it is an option that you have within the game. However, I am not allowing any glitches, exploits, or unnecessary grinding. So, for example, you can easily grind characters on stationary bosses if they have access to 2 range, and I'm not allowing that because I consider it to be a bit of an abuse, a bit of a exploit as it comes to it, you know. It's fine if that's how you want to play. You know, if you watched my charity stream, you saw that I spent quite a lot of time grinding Elincia on a stationary boss and got her ahead in the level curve compared to where she should have been, but I don't consider that when evaluating units. One other thing is that I'm assuming some level of familiarity and some level of sort of experience play, or at least having some amount of competency at Fire Emblem, so I'm not going to, for example, penalize a unit for the fact that, oh no, if I leave my flyer in range of an archer and they get one-rounded by the archer, like, that is a play mistake. I'm also going to be giving units credit for when they give a significant argument for bonus experience over their peers, because theoretically you could give bonus experience to anyone, and it helps just about everyone, but there are definitely some units who make significantly stronger arguments for the bonus experience allocation than others, and they will be given credit for that. I'm not going to assume that they have it, but they will be given credit for the fact that they are more likely to, or at the very least, leverage the bonus experience better than all of their peers. Last thing is about the formatting of the tier list itself. I have ordered the units within the tiers, so the order that they are in is, in my opinion, from strongest unit in the game to weakest unit in the game. However, a unit having multiple units in between them is not a sign that those two units are very different in quality from each other. Instead, what should indicate a couple of units having very different quality from each other is a tier gap. So, for example, I think that Nephany and Maya are actually incredibly similar in terms of the value that they would bring to your team, but there are a lot of units in between them, and that is simply because in that small gap of quality, a lot of units exist. On the flip side, there is a significant gap, in my opinion, between what Ike and Tauroneo bring, even though they are kind of right next to each other on the tier list, but there is a tier gap in between them, and that represents a significant change in quality between the two units. With all of that out of the way, I am going to jump into evaluating the individual units. So we're starting out with S tier, which I have labeled as the best units in the game, and at the very top of S tier, the very best unit in the game, is Marcia. Marcia is your first Pegasus Knight, and it should come as no surprise to Fire Emblem veterans that the early flyer is a good unit. Early flyers are incredibly strong in almost every Fire Emblem title, but Path of Radiance has a few attributes to it that sort of push Marcia over the edge. Generally, one of the things that will hold Pegasus Knights back, or at least the first joining Pegasus Knight, is that their combat is not stellar, and they do need some time training in order to get the ball rolling. However, Marcia is able to skip this task thanks to the existence of bonus experience. She is by far the best beneficiary of bonus experience, and if you dump all of the bonus experience you have at that point, which is going to be a significant amount if you didn't spend any in Chapter 8, she will end up being not just serviceable at combat, but kind of overkill at combat, one-rounding everything she runs into. This on a fast flyer right out the gate is like a super Jagan, the mites that we have never seen. Like, forget Paladin Jagan, she kind of becomes a Falcon Knight Jagan. It's probably not quite enough for her to promote, but she gets pretty darn close, and pretty darn close is good enough for her. However, even if you are not giving her the massive bonus experience dump that I think she earns, she is still going to perform pretty well despite seeming to be an underpowered combat unit. That's because Path of Radiance is on the easier end of Fire Emblem games. I would say it's the second easiest Fire Emblem game, with only Fire Emblem Birthright being easier. But the enemy quality in Path of Radiance is pretty darn low, even on hard mode. This means that it's not difficult for her to secure kills, and oftentimes she doesn't even need to really have them set up for her. She will just sort of happen into getting kills and getting experience and having the ball get rolling that way. I still think you should spend the bonus experience on her regardless, but she's serviceable in her join map, and if you want to do some funny things like meme around by investing in other units, she's going to get experience anyway, just probably somewhat slower than she would if she was given the bonus experience dump. She's not even really that threatened by archers because Path of Radiance has 2x effectiveness instead of 3x effectiveness, meaning that even at base she isn't going to get one round by archers anytime soon. She can just go up against whatever enemies she wants. She's still somewhat frail, but it's not a huge deal, and she's capable of using forged lances if you want to make up for the strength deficit without spending a bunch of bonus experience to power level her. If you do spend a ton of experience to power level her, she will be your hard carry for the rest of the game. She is going to be able to do things that no one else can do. The prison map is one that I tend to stealth, so even if you don't have a ton of bonus experience left over for her on her join map, you will get a bunch the following map just by stealthing the prison. If you don't choose to stealth the prison, then she's probably going to struggle to get bonus experience, but I think you should. It's not that difficult, and the bonus experience is worth it for her and for one other character that we will talk about later. But feeding her that bonus experience or the bonus experience from the initial dump will get the ball rolling, and she'll be able to be a flying beast on the battlefield with a couple of maps that really benefit from flying coming right up. Chapter 11, Blood Runs Red, is one where you just need to arrive, so she can weave through the houses and rivers in order to get to the arrive tile faster. And then Chapter 12 is a map where all of your units are stuck on a boat and being attacked by flying enemies in the Ravens, but Marcia can leave the boat and take the fight to the Ravens in order to defeat them before the reinforcements show up, which is incredibly spectacular. And then after that, Chapter 13 is another defense map on boats. You will have another flyer at that point, but Marcia is still going to be a key part of your clear if you want to get to the defense tile on time, get to the chests on time, and fight the various crows who are flying to try to steal all the treasure from you. After that, there's always going to be use for her flying because you have a river map right afterwards and then a desert map. And even in the maps where flying is not at a premium, she's still going to be a useful 9-move combat unit, and I just don't think that there are any flaws with Marcia. The biggest thing that people will cite is that she has a lower strength cap than the other early flyer we get, which is Jill the Wyvern, and while that does definitely hold her back a little bit in the endgame, especially considering how bulky Path of Radiance enemies get, I think that the significant lead she has over Jill early on is that's the deciding factor for me. It's more important to be an incredibly godlike combat unit when no one else is than to be a incredibly godlike combat unit when a bunch of other people are incredibly godlike combat units. And that's not to say that Marcia is not still useful in the endgame as well. She will still be one of your best units from the time you get her until the very end of the game. She just won't be the definitive best for the last 4 or 5 maps, just because she does kind of wish that she had access to axes and kind of wish that she had a better strength cap. This is one of the games where the strength caps, or the caps in general, actually matter, because your units will often end up hitting them. I don't really know why that is. It just happens. I find that in most playthroughs, units will hit caps for the relevant stats if you are training them. They're usually going to get to 20. I guess it's because you don't early promote in this game, because promotion is from looping past level 20. So units are gaining more stats because they're gaining more levels. But yeah, caps actually matter, and they will come up in some of the evaluations, but I do think people emphasize caps mattering a little bit too much, because yes, the caps actually matter, but they actually matter for like 3 or 4 maps at most, and I think that there's more than 3 or 4 maps in the game. Last time I checked, there were 30. Well, 33 if you count 17 as 4 different maps. Next up, we have Titania, and this is another unit that I think is an uncontroversial pick. Titania is the Jagan of this game, but she is one that does not, quote-unquote, fall off. She has phenomenal stats and phenomenal weapon access in the early game, with access to both axes and lances, as well as 9 movement and absurd strength and speed, with growths that are higher than you would expect for a Jagan. She will keep up for significantly longer than you would expect, as in she should still be being deployed for basically every chapter in the game. She's not going to remain your best paladin for every chapter in the game. I know some people like to compare her to Seth, because Seth is another really centralizing Jagan, but Titania is, in my opinion, less centralizing than Seth is, as her combat, while it keeps up, it doesn't overshadow the other paladins. Seth is a unit who basically makes it so that Franz, Ford, and Kyle are just secondary combat units, whereas Titania will be primary combat until around the time that Oscar, Kieran, and Astrid promote, and then she will fall down into the role of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th best paladin eventually. That said, the 4th best paladin is still someone who you always want to deploy, because in Path of Radiance, paladins have super canto, meaning they get to move after attacking, and that's really good. They also have 9 movement, which is an absurd movement stat, so you also want that. Yeah, Titania is kind of phenomenal, and I don't really know that there's too much more I can say about her. Normally, having access to axes and lances feels a little bit redundant, just because axes are the best weapon type and lances don't add anything that axes don't already have, because they already have 1-2 range. I guess lances are a little bit more accurate, but Path of Radiance isn't a game where accuracy is something you worry about too often. Aside from a couple of units, most people are going to be hitting most attacks, so it's not a big deal. But in the early game, the fact that you don't have the ability to purchase a bunch of 1-2 range hand axes and javelins means that being able to use both hand axes and javelins gives Titania access to every 1-2 range that you have. And you get a single hand axe, a single javelin, a single short spear, and a single short axe in quick succession. The fact that she can choose whichever one of those she wants, or use all 4 of them, is a benefit, and gives you more team flexibility, as if she only had axes, it would mean that you can't really use Boyd to his fullest potential, and if she only had lances, you can't really use Oscar to his fullest potential. The fact she has both, and therefore can use whatever she wants, and also not hinder the other units that are stuck in one weapon type, is definitely a benefit, although long term I would prefer to have both axes and bows, TBH. Last but not least, in S tier, we have Reyson, and Reyson is this game's dancer, which almost by default gives him a spot in the S tier, but Reyson also has a number of other strengths that dancers in other games would love to have. The first of these, and perhaps the least commented on, is his 25 resistance stat. This seems like a nothing burger because your dancer should not be seeing combat, but it gives him more flexibility in where to dance from, as Path of Radiance late game has a lot of siege tomes, and even worse, moving siege tomes at times, meaning that there are a number of squares that your frail units simply can't occupy without risking getting one-shot by a blizzard, bolting, or meteor. However, Reyson's enormous resistance stat ensures that he'll be taking 0 damage, or very close to that, from the enemy siege tomes. This means you don't have to worry about where you are dancing people from as badly, although you do want to be careful of physical units and should be keeping them out of range of bows, especially because he is also a flyer, which is an advantage that he has over other dancers because he can just navigate through terrain more easily than they can. He doesn't have Canto, which is unfortunate, but understandable because it would be a little bit overpowered to have a dancer with Canto. Cough, Radiant Dawn, cough. but it's still incredibly helpful to have a dancer who can move without regards to terrain. It doesn't come up especially often, but it's nice for when you're dancing flyers, and considering that many of the strongest units in the game are flyers, being able to dance flyers from tiles that only flyers can access is nice. And even if you're not dancing a flyer, just being able to move over the terrain without worrying about it means that he falls behind less often than another dancer would, despite his low move. But of course, the big thing that Reyson has is that he is a Laguz unit, which means when his gauge fills up to 20, or if he uses a Laguz stone, he transforms into his animal form. In this case, it is a Heron, and when he is in Heron form, he is not only given extra stats that don't super matter, but able to do a 4-way dance instead of a 1-tile dance, meaning that he is able to dance 4 of your characters, and then you get 4 extra actions instead of 1 extra action. All of the dancers that can do 4-way dances are, in my opinion, by default, better than the 1-way dance, and while it does kind of suck that he's unable to do it on turn 1, it is something that you can do when you need to for a harder map, and in my opinion, Reyson is the best user of the various Laguz stones. It always feels bad using a stone on him because it means he doesn't get to dance on the turn he uses the stone, but the payoff on turn 2 or 3 to be able to do a 4-way dance is kind of phenomenal, and it's better than anything that the combat Laguz to do, in my opinion. Okay, moving on to the A tier. This tier is labeled only barely outclassed, and what I mean by that is these are units who are extremely close to being the best units in the game and will give phenomenal performances every time you use them, but they are definitely worse than the units that I have in S tier, and it is by enough that I think that there's a tier difference, but they still are standouts and should be on basically every team, unless you are just trying not to use them for favoritism reasons. Jill is the first of these, and Jill is, full disclosure, probably my favorite character and unit to use in this game, as well as being my favorite character in the entire series. So there might be some bias going, but I do think that Jill is an incredibly strong unit, even if you ignore the bias. She is the second flyer to join, and like Marcia, she is a lance user, but when she promotes, instead of getting swords like Marcia does, she gets axes, which are the de facto best weapon type in the game. It does kind of suck that it makes her lances a little bit redundant, and since she only gets axes upon promotion, she will struggle to reach the higher ranks in a reasonable time, so she probably won't be using forged silvers until the late game, but you also don't need forged silvers until the late game, so it kind of evens out. You just want to make sure to focus on her axe rank as soon as she promotes so that she can hit those rank thresholds. That being said, Jill is a strong flyer. She benefits from bonus experience, although I don't think she necessarily needs it. She's definitely off to a slower start if she doesn't get it, and she appreciates things like the skill books that show up on her join map, because they can help sort of patch up her shaky accuracy. But other than that, there's not too much to complain about with her. I guess she could also use a Seraph Robe to increase her bulk, but that will also increase naturally as she levels up, which is a good argument for giving her a bonus experience dump. All of the things that I said about Marcia apply to Jill, with the exception of the strength cap, because Jill is in the Wyvern line, so she has a higher strength cap than Marcia has, meaning that she will probably outperform Marcia in the last 4 chapters of the game, or around about that time. This is because enemies are incredibly bulky, and they eventually reach the point where Marcia is unable to one-shot them even with forged silvers, but Jill is able to do so. This is not the biggest deal in the world, and they will both have comparable bulk at that point, so it's not like Marcia failing to one-shot enemies is going to mean that she's going to die, but it is worth taking into consideration that raising Jill will get you a better unit in the endgame. I do think that there is a significant amount of time that Marcia performs better than Jill before that, and that is the reason that Marcia ends up a tier higher than Jill, but Jill should always be on your team, and she's only really going to struggle early on, which can be patched up with a bonus experience or stat boosters, or both. Yeah, not too much else to say about Jill. She joins with a Steel Lance, which can give a little bit of a bad impression because she does have those hit issues, and the Steel Lance doesn't help that. But just throw an Iron or a Slim on her. Her strength is good enough that she's still going to be dealing some amount of damage with them, although she's probably not going to be one-rounding without a couple of levels. And then she gets those levels, and then she starts one-rounding, and then it's Jover for the enemies. Like, use Jill. Jill is phenomenal. Not much more to say about that. Okay, so the only other unit that I have in the A tier is Kieran. Kieran is helped out enormously by his class line of Axe Knight to Paladin, which gives him immediate access to axes, the best weapon type in the game, and eventually upon promotion he gets to choose a second weapon. This is mostly unnecessary, as 99% of the time you are still going to be using axes with him, but he can benefit from bows in order to do some 2-range stuff, or swords if you care about accuracy. His hit isn't really that shaky though, so I don't think it matters all that much. He joins in Chapter 11 with pretty phenomenal bases. He has 11 strength, 12 speed, 10 defense, and notably, if you give him the Master Seal that you got in Chapter 10, he will just turn into another copy of Titania with less resistance. I don't think that's the best route to go with him, but I do bring it up to sort of emphasize how good his bases are. He is just a Master Seal away from being another Titania. I know Titania's probably gotten a few levels by now, so she will still be ahead of him if you do that, but he has more quote-unquote room to grow, and it's not that hard to grow him. Obviously, you can feed him the bonus experience, and he joins right after you get a massive amount of it, so this isn't the worst thing in the world to do. I personally don't like giving him the bonus experience because there's another unit who joins later who benefits from it much more, but Kieran is still a decent candidate for it if you want to make use of his 50% strength growth, or 40% speed growth, or 40% defense growth. Yeah, this guy's growths are also pretty amazing, and because he's in a Cavalier/Paladin class line, he also gets access to 9 move and Super Canto, meaning that he can do hit and run tactics if you're worried about his survivability, which you probably shouldn't be, because 30 HP and 10 defense with a 60% HP growth and 40% defense growth means he's still going to be one of your bulkier units. But the 9 movement helps him get to the front line more, and being able to Super Canto away from things can let him help out with positioning. He can also rescue people out of danger if you're using some infantry that might need rescues, or rescue people forward if you're using like a staff user who's going to have less movement and wants to be rescued forward so that they can use the rescue staff. Yeah, there's so much good about being in the Paladin class line. It might seem a little bit weird that Kieran is ahead of the other Paladins other than Titania, obviously, because performance-wise in the end of the game, and even as you get into the late game, he and the other Paladins are incredibly similar to each other, but I do think that he is the one who doesn't have he doesn't have flaws that are holding him back. He joins ready to go and remains ready to go with no real investment. Like, you just need to use him and he'll keep up with everyone. Whereas everyone else has some issue that I will talk about when we get to them. Notably, Kieran also has the best supports of all the Paladins, as he can support either Marcia or Oscar, meaning there are 2 different options for frontline buddies for him. I like supporting him with Oscar because Oscar has the Earth affinity, which is very good because it gives a void, but you can give him Marcia as well. I just find that Marcia ends up sort of soloing portions of the map because she's a flyer and can go places that non-flyers can't, whereas Kieran and Oscar end up going to the same areas because they're both stuck as grounded units who can't be rescued either, so they really do have to move in sort of that grounded line. They can't go over rivers and stuff as infantry and flyers could by being, like, infantry by being rescued by flyers, and then flyers just by being flyers. So they end up in the same portions of the map, and they work really well together. It's almost as if they are a Cain and Abel archetype. But yeah, I do think that it is worth noting that he does have a second option for frontliner support, where the other frontliners do not. But I do think you should be supporting with Oscar. They just work really well together, and they are both pretty bulky and get access to Soul, which is the best mastery skill in the game, as it improves their bulk. And yeah, use Kieran. Kieran is phenomenal, and he's definitely a step above the other Paladins. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't use the other Paladins, but Kieran does everything that you want him to do for free, and will have a higher axe rank than the other ones. or at least will have axes sooner than the other ones, so he gets access to things like forged silvers, forged hand axes, regular hand axes, sooner than the others do. I don't even really think he needs any stat boosters to fix him up, because despite using axes, which are not super accurate in most Fire Emblem games, his skill is fine. He's got a 10 base and a 50% growth, so like, use Kieran. Kieran is definitely a step above the other paladins. If you're only going to use one, you should use him, but you also should use more than one. Okay, so moving on to the B tier, which I have labeled as team staples with minor flaws. What I mean by this is they are someone who should probably be on your team for every single map that they're available. However, they do definitely have some flaws that will hold them back, and those are worth acknowledging and do put them, in my opinion, a tier lower than Jill and Kieran, who are almost flawless units. And the first of these is Tanith. Tanith is a pre-promoted Falcon Knight who joins with very good strength and notably very good magic as well. She has 16 strength and 10 magic, meaning that she is arguably better at doing magical damage than the mages, simply because she's a flyer with decent magic and access to both swords and lances, meaning she can use 3 magical weapons: the Sonic Sword, which is flyer effective, the Ruin Sword, which has the Nosferatu effect, and the Flame Lance, which doesn't really do anything special. It's effective against Beast Lagoos, but that doesn't fucking matter. It is mostly just the fact that she is a flyer, and so she has 9 movement and Super Canto, as opposed to being a mage, which means that she would have 6 movement and no Super Canto. And also couldn't move on terrain tiles as well as flyers can, unless you're in the desert, which is weird. But yeah, I do think that those benefits are significant and enough to make her the quote-unquote best mage in Tellius. Now, being a mage isn't a super great thing to be in Tellius. Hitting on resistance is not what it used to be, simply because generic enemies tend to actually have resistance stats. Even generals will sometimes have resistance stats. But it is useful to be able to do if you run up against a high defense enemy. There are some generals who you want to hit on their res as opposed to their defense, and it's nice to have. And the Sonic Sword is in particular very good because since Tanith is a flyer, and it is flyer effective, she ends up fighting wyverns extremely well because she can fight them in their own terrain and deal effective damage and hit their weaker res stat. That said, she's generally going to be using physical weapons instead of magical weapons, just because it's usually better to use physical weapons than magical weapons, since she has 6 more strength and a higher strength growth. Well, it's only 5% higher, but it's still 40% strength over 35% magic, and also a higher 6 base, means that she makes better use of physical weapons than magical weapons, unless it's in specific scenarios. But yeah, she's a very, very competent member of your team. She's probably going to be worse than both Jill and Marcia at that point, but another flyer is nice to have. However, that alone would not be enough to learn her in the B tier, or at the very least wouldn't be enough to put her at the highest part of the B tier, just because her availability is so bad and she's not going to be your best flyer at the time she joins. However, she has the Reinforce skill, which is an incredibly useful skill. Basically, twice per map you can call 3 expendable bodies, and they actually do pretty good combat. It's notable that on Maniac mode, these yellow units scale with the enemy Maniac mode bonuses, and so they will be incredibly devastating and usually stronger than your strongest units. However, even on hard mode, they are pretty good and pretty nice to have. They're never going to be stronger than your units unless you're doing like a zero growths context, but they will be doing some amount of damage and can be directed to an extent so it's not completely random. Additionally, they're just good as bodies. Sometimes you need to distract a sleep staff or a group of enemies who shows up from behind. Notably, on Tanith's Join map, Chapter 18, there are a couple of Cavaliers who join at the very beginning of the map, very early on, or very late on, and since it's a route map, it can be annoying to have to leave someone behind to fight them or trudge back through the long hallway, but Tanith's reinforcements sort of clean them up, as Tanith's reinforcements will spawn in the same spot that those red Cavaliers spot. So you can just summon them and take out those calves. And there's a couple of other chapters where reinforcements from behind can get held off by the yellow units, or you can just direct the yellow units to be good target practice. Extra bodies are very nice, and I think extra bodies stapled to a unit who you're probably deploying anyway means that she belongs at the very top of the B tier. Reinforce is just quite powerful. It's not the only powerful thing that she has, but it is enough to me to sort of push her over the top and make her better than the other paladins. Although, if you get less use out of Reinforce, I can see her moving down in the tier list and being below Astrid and Oscar. Okay, next up in B tier is Astrid, and Astrid is a very weird unit when you first look at her. She joins in Chapter 13 with 6 strength, 7 speed, 5 defense, 20 HP, and gets 1 rounded by enemies on her join map on turn 1 as a green unit, meaning that you have to employ some shove and smite strats just to get to her, which is kind of pathetic before you even take into account the fact that she is a bow knight and therefore locked to bows, which is not a great weapon. Arguably the worst weapon in the game. It's competing for that title with swords. I think for a cavalier, it's probably better to have bows than swords because you can do pot shots and then super canto away. But even being in the paladin class isn't enough to save a unit that joins this late with stats this pathetic. She has respectable growth rates with 50% speed and 40% strength, but that's not why she's in B tier. It's because she has access to Paragon. Paragon doubles the amount of experience that she gets, and this includes bonus experience. In Fire Emblem 10, Paragon no longer applies to bonus experience, but in Fire Emblem 9, Paragon is going to double the amount of experience she gets from bonus experience, meaning that she will very quickly level up if you give her a bonus experience dump. She starts far behind the rest of your team, but if you can just keep her alive for one map, then you can immediately pump a butt ton of bonus experience into her, and suddenly she's just another paladin with stats that are comparable to Oscar and Kieran. And she's going to surpass them eventually because she will be gaining experience faster than them, even as she catches up and even as she becomes a promoted unit and ahead of the enemies, she's still going to be gaining more experience, so she's still going to be gaining more levels. I would argue that there is a case for leaving Paragon on her throughout the entire playthrough. Personally, I like taking it off once she reaches promotion, but if you do that, then she just sort of becomes another paladin. It makes room for Soul, which is nice, but it means that she sort of falls behind, or not falls behind, but fails to surpass the other two, and just stays on par with them. All of the Cavaliers, or all of the Paladin Cavaliers in this game have very similar stats at the same level as each other. So the things that differentiate them from each other isn't that like, oh, Astrid has slightly more speed than Oscar, but slightly less strength, or Oscar and Astrid have a little bit less bulk than Kieran does. Instead, it is everything surrounding their join situation. Whichever paladin you use long term is generally going to just look like the same stats at the same level. Like, notably, all 4 of them have very close to identical stats at 21, which is generally when I think you should be promoting the Cavaliers. But Paragon means that Astrid gets to 21 faster than the others if you are willing to give her a bonus experience dump. All you need to do with the bonus experience dump as well is just catch her up to Kieran and Oscar. Like, she doesn't need to go above them from bonus experience. Once she catches up to whatever level they're on, she's going to perform just as well as they do. Being stuck on bows is a little bit annoying, but it is not the worst thing in the world for a mounted unit, because Super Canto means she can just do the drive-bys. She can just shoot someone and then canto away and not have an enemy phase. You know, not having an enemy phase kind of sucks, but at least she's not getting hit by people. And Paragon will ensure that her experience keeps up, and then when she promotes, she gets axes, and with a hand axe, she's just golden. Now she's going to continue to gain experience, continue to snowball, and maybe eventually you replace Paragon with Soul, but if you are using enough paladins that you don't really need, like you don't have the Occult Skull to spare, Paragon is arguably going to be doing as much, if not significantly more for her than Soul would. I just find Soul fun, so that's why I do it in my playthroughs, but Paragon is very good. Paragon is the reason that Astrid is above Oscar. It has nothing to do with their stat differences. It has nothing to do with their weapon differences. Technically, bows plus axes is slightly better than bows plus lances, and technically their stats are slightly different. I think Astrid has a speed advantage, but Oscar has a little bit of a strength advantage, but ultimately none of those things matter. They are both going to be primarily axe paladins, and they are both going to get there around the same time, just Astrid is then going to soar ahead and be at a higher level because of Paragon. And I guess with that, we should transition into Oscar, because Oscar is also in the B tier, and he is in the B tier for a lot of the same reasons as Astrid. All of his upsides are the same ones as Astrid. Like I said, he, Astrid, and Kieran, and even Makalov have very similar stats to each other at 21. There's some minor differences, but they're going to get axes at that point and just perform very, very similarly. However, Oscar joins in Chapter 1, which should be an argument in his favor, especially considering that training units in Path of Radiance is not particularly hard. Enemy quality is very low, and you can just pump bonus experience into people, and being in Chapter 1 means that Oscar is going to have that availability, like, utility in the early game chapters. He can do stuff in Chapter 1, he can do stuff in Chapter 2, and he should get credit for that, and he does get credit for that. I just don't think he does a lot in those early chapters. He's missing from Chapters 3 and 4, which are, in my opinion, the worst chapter, or I guess 3 is not that bad, but Chapter 4 is a chapter that is pretty rough to be missing from, because there's a lot to do on that chapter. Or rather, there's like a lot of enemies. It's a little bit of a dangerous chapter. You just got Soren, and you have to protect Soren and Rhys, but you can just handle all of that with Shinon and Gatrie, and Oscar not being there means he can't, like, get credit for doing that. Titania basically solos the first 7 chapters of the game. She can do more than that as well, obviously, and you can use other units. Notably on Chapter 2, Oscar is necessary for a couple of enemies in the first few turns, but then Titania shows up and she just can wreck house, and Oscar becomes unnecessary. You can feed him, and slowing down to feed him does definitely help a little bit, but it's not going to solve the problem of him being, like, still low level by the end of 7 if you are not sandbagging Titania. Now, obviously, you can sandbag Titania, and this will kind of help Oscar, but you're also making things harder for yourself by doing so, because you are not using one of the best units of the game at the time where she is at her best, in order to feed a unit who is just going to turn out pretty close to identical to a couple of other units who show up for free. Like, Oscar won't perform worse than Kieran if they're at the same level, but it is hard to get Oscar at the same level as Kieran by the time that Kieran joins without feeding him some bonus experience. He is a decent beneficiary of bonus experience, but that is experience that you are depriving from either Jill or Astrid, depending on the point in the game that you're giving it to him. Or not Jill and Astrid, Marcia or Astrid, depending on the point of the game that you are giving it to him. And Marcia becomes a much better unit just because of flight, and Astrid leverages it better because she gets twice as many levels out of it. So it just sort of leaves Oscar in this weird situation where he's always a little bit behind where you want him to be. Also, not having axes hurts a little bit. I would much rather have axes plus bows than axes plus lances, because it makes the lances kind of redundant, but it's not a huge deal, and I feel like some people, including myself, have sometimes overblown how much starting with lances when you want to have axes makes Oscar worse than Kieran. It is really just sort of the awkward situation around feeding him experience that leads him to be worse. Statistically, he's going to have a little bit less strength than Kieran, but again, it's not a huge deal, especially considering the enemy quality for Path of Radiance enemies. Yeah, he's probably going to fail to one-round some people, especially in the late game, but it's not super big deal, and you can make up for that by forging silvers. And I think with a forged silver, Oscar will still perform probably on par with Kieran, because Kieran with forged silver is a little bit overkill, and you have plenty of money, so forged silvers isn't a huge cost. Still, I do think that lack of access to Paragon and lack of access to just sort of the phenomenal join situation that Kieran has, the fact that you do have to baby him a little bit or feed him some bonus experience you would rather give to other people, does make Oscar feel worse than his other 2 Paladin counterparts, but he's still an absolutely phenomenal unit and should be on every team, unless, like me, you just hate him for really no justifiable reason. Now we move on to the C tier, which I have labeled as either combat staples with significant flaws, or solid utility throughout the game. The difference between significant flaws and minor flaws is that it is a big enough flaw or a big enough series of flaws that there is potentially a reason not to bring them on every single team. They're not going to be the standout auto-includes that all of the units in S, A, and B are. However, if you do choose to utilize these units, they will either be phenomenal for some portion of the game or the entire game, depending on the unit. And the first of these is Stefan. Stefan is one who I would say his combat is phenomenal for the entirety of the game. He joins you in Chapter 15 with some very nutty stats. He has 19 strength and 25 speed, 27 skill. He's a swordmaster with Astra and S swords, so he can immediately use the Vague Kadi or silver swords or any sword you want. Brave sword, whatever you want, he's got it. His crit rate is going to be very high. He's going to be doubling everything and dealing nutty damage to them as well. And it's not like these bases come with the trade-off that he has very bad growth. He has 50% strength and 55% speed, which is better than Kieran. But then we come to the fact that he's a Swordmaster. Swordmaster is not an especially good class, and it's really dragged down by the fact that the Paladins in this game have stats that, while not quite as good and like blow you out of the water than Stefan's, are still going to keep up and do enough work. Speed thresholds are not incredibly hard to meet, so his nutty 25% speed basically just contributes to dodge tanking, which isn't super necessary and is replicable via the earth support that some of the better characters in the game give. Well, I say some of the better characters. It's Tanith and Oscar. They're the only good characters who give earth support, in my opinion. But yeah, Stefan is still going to be a solid combat unit if you use him, but he will struggle to keep pace with the rest of your army because he's locked to infantry move at 7 and locked to 1 range unless he uses the Sonic Sword, which notably he has 8 magic, so he can use the Sonic Sword almost as well as Tanith can. The problem is that since he's not a flyer, it's harder for him to fight wyverns, which are, in my opinion, the premier enemies you want to fight with the Sonic Sword, since enemies with resistance are scattered everywhere, and yeah, I'd much rather hit on a low resistance enemy than a unit than an enemy whose resistance is probably close to their defense, especially when there's such a startling difference in his strength and magic stats. That said, like, he will delete enemies with Astra, and he will enemy phase anything that doesn't have 1-2 range. Unfortunately, the late game Path of Radiance, you do want high movement, and you do want 1-2 range just to keep up, but if he's player phasing things, and if he's enemy phasing things that have 1 range, he's not going to have any trouble defeating them. Even Armor Knights he can break with swords, which is pretty impressive because swords are a low might weapon. I guess the fact that he's stuck on low might weapons does kind of negate, but like it works counter to his very good strength base and growth. But you can just throw a silver on him. He doesn't even really need a forged silver, but just a regular silver even can do enough to like take out most enemies, and enemy quality is not so high that he's going to be struggling to deal significant damage to them, even with the low might of swords. But on the flip side, enemy quality is not so high that you need his nutty speed stat. So it just sort of evens out to be like an unnecessary amount of combat. It's still going to be very good when you have it, and Astra is going to delete whatever it procs on, but it's less necessary than it would be in a game with higher quality enemies. And the fact that he is unable to keep up with the horses or unable to keep up with the flyers just sort of, it really hurts his long-term viability. The next unit on the list is Lethe, and she is the first of our Laguz units, unless you count Reyson. Laguz are in a weird spot, so I feel like I should take a moment to talk about how they work and the general issues that their builds have, so that we can not have to repeat ourselves over and over every time I'm talking about a Laguz unit's combat. So Laguz are locked to 1 range, and they are only able to use their claws or fangs or beaks, which are unforgeable weapons. This means that when your other characters get access to things like 1-2 range or forged silvers and forged steels, the Laguz are not going to be able to utilize those tools, which means that their combat will suffer as the game goes on, simply because they can't use those tools. Additionally, despite the fact that Laguz have pretty good stats for their join time in almost every case, they are held back by the fact that they have to deal with the Laguz gauge. The Laguz gauge is a meter that slowly builds up whenever they are untransformed until it hits 20, and then once it hits 20, they transform into their beast form. In their beast form, Laguz have 9 movement, which is paladin movement, and access to doing combat with their claws or beaks or fangs or whichever Laguz weapon they use. However, every time they do combat or end turn, their meter will drain slightly, and when it hits 0, they transform into their human form. The human form is only 7 movement, so it's promoted infantry movement, but it is still infantry movement. Additionally, in the promoted form, they suffer a little bit of a stat penalty, or rather, they get a stat bonus in the beast form, but their stats are worse in human form, and crucially, they are unable to do any combat at all. Anytime that they are attacked, or anytime that they end turn, they will gain a little bit of meter, and once it hits 20, they're going to transform into the beast again, but they do have this sort of push-pull of in some turns they're just literally incapable of doing anything, and also have less movement. Depending on who the Laguz is, they will start with a different gauge meter, and this is the primary factor in determining how good their combat is going to be. And for Lethe, she starts with 16, which means at the start of player phase turn 1, she gets 20 and immediately transforms. She will have roughly 4 turns of very good combat before she transforms back into a human. And while this sounds like pretty bad because she only gets 4 turns, it's important to note that the first 4 turns of a map tend to be the most important turns, with the exception of some of the longer maps like Clash or Without a King. The majority of maps are able to be cleared in like 5 or 6 turns, so Lethe is doing combat for the majority of them, and especially early on, her combat is phenomenal. Like I said, she gets outclassed once your units have access to 1-2 range and forges, but early on, not everyone's going to get a forge. The forges are not going to be super powerful, and 1-2 range is good, but it's less necessary, as a lot of enemies are locked to 1 range. It is worth noting that Laguz take effective damage from Laguz slaying weapons and from various spells. For the Beast Laguz, which Lethe is one of, the fire spells will deal effective damage to her, but this is a game with 2x effectiveness, so it's not as big a deal. And Lethe kind of does just function like a paladin who's locked to 1 range after she joins. Now, this isn't going to keep up. She will eventually fall off because she's using promoted experience gain. Her growths are not terrible, but they're not enough to make up for the fact that she's getting promoted experience gain and she faces all of the other issues as you hit the mid-game. But I absolutely think you should deploy her when you have her, until you get other units that outclass her. Around the time that your units are promoting, Lethe is no longer going to be necessary because 9 movement is less of a niche. Once both Astrid, Oscar, and Kieran have it, in addition to Titania, and also Marcia, and also Jill, like suddenly Lethe's ability to soar ahead of your army is less unique, but, you know, she's good while you have her, and I do think that the early game is harder than the late game, so it's nice to have a unit who is good in the early game with basically no investment. So next up we have Makalov, and Makalov is a unit who I think is actually pretty severely underrated by the community. Don't get me wrong, there's a reason that he's an entire tier below the other 2 Cavaliers, but people talk about him like he's completely worthless and has no place on any team, and that's just simply not the case. Makalov's starting situation is definitely a little bit tragic. He has worse bases than Kieran several chapters after Kieran joined, and doesn't even have Paragon like Astrid to make the leveling process easier, but he can still level up either by killing low quality enemies, which there are plenty of on his join map and beyond, or by getting fed bonus experience, since this is Path of Radiance after all. If you do that, his stats are going to basically resemble all of your other paladins. Like, comparing him to Kieran at 21, he has 1 less point of strength and 1 more point of defense, and everything else is very close to the same. Swords kind of suck, and it does make training him on the map a little bit harder because you'd rather either have access to axes because they're a good weapon, or bows so you can do hit and run stuff from 2 range, but it's not the end of the world, especially considering that all of the paladins get axes on promotion, and 99% of the time you're only going to use axes for combat once you promote. So Makalov is still just going to be a fine paladin and probably be about on par with all of your other ones. It's a pain in the butt to get him there, and it's more annoying than training either Astrid or Oscar, but that's the only reason that I have him a tier lower than them. In the long term, he will turn out very close to them. He even has the benefit of having a good support partner in Astrid, so if you don't like sending Kieran and Oscar to round out parts of the map together, you can send Astrid and Makalov to round out parts of the map together, and that's fine. I know people hate the ship, but they do work together well as supporting paladins. Next up is our first mage, Callil, and much like the Lagoos, mages have drawbacks that are tied to their class that will impact all of the mages from here on forward. So I want to get them out of the way before we talk about Callil specifically. Mages in Tellius are held back by 3 things, really. The first is that enemies actually have resistance stats and not just Pegasus Knights and mages, but even things like paladins, halberdiers, and even some generals have respectable resistance stats. It's actually kind of funny, some of the general bosses have higher resistance than they do defense, and like generals are the classes that you generally expect mages to be best suited for taking out. So the fact that they're not even especially good at that compared to physical units with effective weaponry, or even just forged silvers, is not great for them. Speaking of generals, mages and sages have armor knight and general movement respectively, which is kind of just feels like an unnecessary debuff. I made an argument in a video last week about how armor knights being given 1 less move is a pretty significant and unfair nerf to the class, and I think the same applies to mages and sages in the games where that is the case for them, which to my knowledge is just Tellius. Even FE4 gives mages not as bad move penalties as Armor Knight. I think they might be on par with the other infantry, but in Tellius, mages have 1 less movement than physical infantry, which just feels cruel when you consider that, like, magic isn't at a premium in this game series anyway. On top of that, pre-promoted sages will run into the problem where none of the pre-promotes actually have staff access. Instead, they have knives, which they do give the pre-promoted sages like respectable strength stats so that they can use knives, but they're going to be dealing more damage with magic anyway because knives are a terrible weapon type. You can't forge knives, whereas you could forge tomes theoretically, although it's also worth noting that tomes are the most expensive things to forge in the game. This is in part due to the fact that the price of a forge is based on the percentage you are increasing its stats by, and since tomes tend to have low might, you are increasing their stat by a higher percentage. You also can only forge the first tier of tomes, so you can forge fire, wind, or thunder, or light, but you cannot forge L-fire, L-thunder, L-wind, or L-light, etc., etc., which is a very big drawback because other weapons can have their iron, steel, silver, and 1-2 range variants forged, which is, it's just really unfortunate for mages all around. They have all of those debuffs. Additionally, even for the ones who have staff access, who are the unpromoted ones, when they promote they can get staves, the staffs are not especially valuable in Tellius. The only really good staff is Rescue, and you really only need 1 Rescue staff user. Physic is nice, and you can steal some extra physics with your thieves. However, I find that it's pretty unnecessary. Units in Tellius tend to be extremely bulky, and this is both true for the enemies and the player units, which means that your units will need healing a lot less than they would in other games. They're also just not under that many threats because enemy quality is pretty low, and the units you're going to be frontlining with are usually flyers and cavaliers. The cavaliers have access to soul, and also everyone has super canto, so if they're in danger, they can just super canto out of danger, and potentially even vulnerary and then just enemy phase everyone, because you can have up to 4 healing items, since healing items and weapons take up different inventory slots. With all of that out of the way, you can see why none of the mages or sages in this game are in the team staples, but a lot of teams want a mage or sage, and Callil is sort of like the go-to easiest one. The reason for this is it just doesn't cost any effort to get her there. She joins around the time that you'll have access to 2 siege tomes, which are very nice, and she has the ranks to use every single siege tome in the game just from base. She also has very good magic and pretty decent speed as well as decent strength, so she's not weighed down as much by siege tomes. She can feasibly double some enemies with siege tomes, which is nice utility. I would say that she's more of a utility unit than a combat unit. You can use her combat with other tomes, and it is nice to have someone who can hit on res other than just Tanith. She will be doing more damage hitting on res than Tanith, but the enemies that you hit on res are few and far between, and it's usually just wyverns, and she's going to have trouble getting to them. So I think that Callil is mostly just here because she is lower effort. She's not going to be as good as the other mages who are trained, but she's serviceable, she's good enough, and mages are just not in a great spot in Tellius. She doesn't have access to staves, which is a little bit of a drawback, but I think it is less of a big deal than people say it is, just because staff access is not super valuable. It's nice to roll compress and have a combat unit and a staffer on the same body, but if we're completely honest, none of the mages are combat units in a realistic sense. And 6 movement is just very sad. She's going to need to be rescue dropped and shoved and smited to the front lines at all times. And then you're just devoting multiple slots to getting one unit to keep up with the rest of your army. She's better because you don't have to train her, but like, it is just the utility of siege tomes more than anything else. The next 2 units are Mordecai and Muaram, our 2 tiger Lagus. There are some differences between them, but I think that they are similar enough that I want to talk about them together, as they are both tiger Lagus who have suboptimal gauges. In Mordecai's case it is 0, and Muaram's it is 9. So we'll be locked to 7 movement and no combat for the first couple of turns of every map. However, they have utility outside of doing combat, and that is in being able to shove, or in Mordecai's case, smite, very heavy mounted units. They both have 57 weight when transformed, or 42 if not transformed. This means that they can shove the majority of your horse units, as well as Marcia and Tanith, and with 2 statue frags, they are capable of shoving or smiting a promoted Jill. Now, obviously, there are only 2 statue frags in the game, so you can only give them to one of the Lagus. And I think that Mordecai is pretty definitively the better person for this, because he starts with the smite skill, whereas Muaram needs to wait until you acquire the smite skill to give it to him. Additionally, you get the statue frags before you get Muaram, but you have Mordecai at that time, so just feeding them to Mordecai allows him to smite Jill when he's transformed. If he's untransformed, there's fewer people that he can shove or smite, but you can use the Demiband on him and turn him into a 9-move smite bot. His combat isn't particularly impressive, but he's always going to be able to smite regardless of his stats, and so I think he's worth a deploy if you care about moving Jill to important places on the map, or moving your Cavaliers or Pegasuses. Obviously, the Demiband is only going to be able to equip by one of them at a time, so the Demibands and the Statue Frags are resources that they're both fighting over. However, you do still get usage out of the one that is not given the Demiband and the Statue Frags. 7 movement and the ability to shove and later smite Cavaliers means that Muaram is still going to be useful. Muaram's combat is also a little bit better than Mordecai's, but I don't think it's particularly notable because by the time that you get Muaram, the Lagu's combat problems have started to really shine, and even Lethe is someone who you should have ditched by now. Now, Muaram's combat is slightly better than Lethe's, but I do not think it is enough to make up for the inability to equip forges, inability to equip 1-2 range, and the trouble of having to deal with gauges. Demiband, which comes on Muaram, means he no longer has to deal with gauges. However, I do think that the Demiband is better used for the shove/smite purposes, in which case Mordecai is going to be better at it because a transformed Mordecai with the statue frags can smite Jill, which, again, transformed Muaram with both statue frags can also smite Jill. However, it's longer for him to get smite, and it's also longer for him to even show up to be able to shove. So Mordecai just sort of gets these resources by default. In an Iron Man context, if Mordecai dies before you give him the Demiband and Statue Frags, Muaram can still do that role, but it takes him longer because you still have to wait for the smite scroll, and you still have to wait for Muaram. Next up, we have another pair of similar units, the Staffbots, Riss and Mist. They fulfill very similar roles in the early game because they are just dedicated healers, but Rys is by far better at this role early on because he has a magic base of 10 and a growth of 60%. Normally, I don't think the magic stat matters that much on healers. However, in Rys's case, it is so far above and the healing formula is not especially good that he's going to be regularly topping off your units while Mist is not. He's going to maintain a magic stat lead on her basically throughout the game, and funny enough, he also maintains a magic stat lead on the mages, the trainee mages being Ilyana, Soren, and Tormod. Granted, they are more likely to get experience quickly because he has to deal with the fact that staff experience is annoyingly slow, but it is kind of funny that normally healers have bad magic stats and combat mages have good magic stats, but, well, they don't have bad magic stats, but Rys has better than them. It's really funny. If you do promote him as well, his light magic rank is tied to his staff rank, so he doesn't have to deal with boosting the weapon ranks of a different weapon than the one he had been using before promotion. Additionally, he is the only character in the game who can use arm scrolls to increase his staff rank because he can use them to equip light magic and then boost the equipped rank of light magic, which also boosts the staff rank since it is a shared rank. Not that this is especially necessary because he will usually hit the staff thresholds you need on time. Rescue is only B rank and that is the one you want to get, and if you're using him enough to train him and promote him, even if you use the Master Seal to promote him at level 10, he's gonna hit Rescue by the time you get it in Jill's dad's chapter. He is also probably going to be the best user of Rescue, even if you've trained up one of the mages, just because he has a longer range. And it takes him less of an effort to get there, since the mages end up with E rank upon promotion. That said, everything I said when talking about Callil applies to Rys. Staves are a lot less necessary in terms of healing, just because your units tend to be more efficient, especially in the mid to late game. So Rys's utility early on falls off pretty hard. However, I do think the fact that he has that early availability and is also better at it when he's early makes him better than Mist, who is the other dedicated healer. She has a potentially better endgame. While her magic stat is not going to be as impressive as Rys's, she does get a horse and therefore access to Canto, and can theoretically use arm scrolls to get access to the Sonic Sword and therefore kind of roleplay as a mounted mage. But it's not enough to make her a viable combat unit, and especially because it's unlikely to get her to Ruin Sword. So she kind of just ends up being the second healer for if Rys died, and considering that the first healer is a position that's not super useful once you get into the mid-game, the second healer is generally going to be worse. She can still do stuff, and I do think that having a single staffer on the team is nice, especially because her horse movement will allow her to potentially utilize Rescue better than Rys, just because even though he has a better magic stat, she has a better movement stat. Shoving her gets harder, so if you want to set up shove chains to rescue Rys, then Rys is probably better as a rescue bot, but in that case, there are other unpromoted, or rather unmounted staffers who can do that, namely the Ilyana, Soren, and Tormods of your team. But yeah, generally speaking, I think that Mist is slightly worse than Rys, but they're both staff bots in a game where staffing only gets you so far. So next up we have the D tier, which I define as good filler. A good filler is a unit who is never going to be a main combat unit in your army, but you're not unhappy about deploying them when you have extra deployment slots. And at the very top of this list is Haar. It's weird to describe Haar as a filler unit because he's a Wyvern Lord, which is the best class in both this and most Fire Emblem games. He also has B rank axes, meaning he gets the Brave Axe from base, and his strength, defense, and HP are pretty good. His speed is kind of abysmal. Like, he's not going to be getting doubled, but he's rarely going to be doubling things. The biggest problem is that your trained flyers are going to be significantly better at combat than him, and honestly, so are your trained paladins, and there's only 7 maps in the game left. He joins too late in his join map for me to count that as a map where he has a significant amount of utility, which really stinks because it's a map where flight is kind of at a premium, and there's only one more of those afterwards, that being Strange Lands, the Eat Rock map. So Haar just sort of struggles from the fact that, yeah, he's a flyer with pretty okay combat, but I'd rather be a paladin with extremely good combat or a flyer with extremely good combat at that point in the game. He's still good to deploy, and of these, he is arguably the one who makes the greatest case to not be considered a filler unit, but at the end of the day, he's not going to be a combat carry for any portion of the game, and his availability holds him back more than anything else. His growths are actually pretty okay, with the exception of his speed stat just not being good enough at base to really be recoverable. And yeah, I guess you could sink some bonus experience into him if you want, but at the end of the day, I kind of just like him being a filler role as opposed to trying to overinvest in him and get more out of him than he comes with naturally. So next up is Janaff, and this is another unit I think is a little bit underrated. He's still only a filler unit because he is ultimately a Laguz, and so he struggles with the Laguz gauge and weapon problems, but he has Lethe's gauge and flight, which, is still pretty good for a filler combat unit. I think he's worth deploying for a few maps, and then eventually you'll have someone with better combat than him, and you don't use him after that. But having Lethe's gauge is better than having any other gauge for Laguz. His stats are fine. Flight is the big benefit for him. There's a couple of flight-heavy maps shortly after he joins, those being the Naysala map, the Jill's Dad map, and then Without a King, which has a lot of water for him to fly over. I think after that, there's not too much for him to do. I guess in the bridge map, he's also okay because of the large number of holes that he doesn't want to fall into, but there's also ballistas, and you can only give the full guard to so many people. Janaff is fine, but nothing exceptional. I would recommend trying him out if you never have before, but you're not going to be blown away. He's just going to be good filler, and that's what this tier is for. The next two units are another one I want to talk about as a pair because they don't exactly fit the description of good filler, but I do think they are around the same quality as a filler unit. Shinon and Gatrie both are available for Chapter 3, Chapter 4, Chapter 5, and Chapter 7 before leaving you and eventually rejoining you much later in the campaign. At this time, their combat is actually pretty phenomenal. Shinon almost feels like a second Jagan as a sniper, and gives a really unfair impression of how good bow units are, just because he has phenomenal combat at that time, and then eventually you realize that archers and snipers are actually kind of trash in this game, and most Fire Emblem games. Gatrie is not as overkill, but he is incredibly bulky, and most enemies will be dealing 0 damage to him. He's quite useful for getting through these early maps, and they're not exactly difficult, but they are maps where, his bulk is helpful. In particular, keeping Soren alive or helping out with the defense map are good roles that he can play, as well as he and Shinon's position in Chapter 7 being very beneficial for clearing that map as quickly as possible. Then they leave, and when they come back, Gatrie is more salvageable than Shinon, but still neither of them is someone who you really want to deploy afterwards. Theoretically, Gatrie could be above Shinon because he is slightly more salvageable long-term, but Shinon has a better first impression in those early chapters, and I do think that their performance in the early chapters is the only thing that elevates them above bad filler, because if you're deploying Gatrie or even worse Shinon in a map after they rejoin you, they really do just feel like bad filler. Up next is Boyd, and Boyd is the most filler unit who ever fillered. He joins you early on and has basically the same availability as Oscar, but he's an infantry unit, and so that always kind of sucks. He uses axes, which is theoretically better than using lances or swords, but realistically kind of makes him feel worse just because he has hit and doubling issues thanks to the heavy weight and low accuracy of axes, combined with his not exactly great speed and not exactly great skill. He is very subject to RNG Screw or RNG Bless because in his first level up, strength and speed can really make the difference between getting doubled and doubling, thanks to the way that weapon weight is countered by strength. It is a huge boon if you get strength and speed on his first level up and makes him perform significantly better, and it's not super unlikely to happen. He has decent growths in both of them, but if he doesn't get it, then he just becomes the most abysmal unit ever. He's frequently going to be facing 70 and 60% hit rates, and Usually you bench him once you have the deployment slots and units to not need him. Still, he's appreciated in the early game, he's useful in Chapter 8, he's okay in Chapter 9, and if you want to play Chapter 10 like a combat map instead of a stealth map, he's also pretty good there. After that, I'm not sure that there's much reason to use him, but, he's still filler. He's a better filler unit than some of the late joiners, if you are willing to invest in him and use him. I just don't think he especially justifies that investment. Of note, he, Oscar, and Rolf do have access to a triangle attack if they all promote and get bows, but this requires sandbagging Oscar and not giving him axes, which is really tragic and you shouldn't do. Next up is Ulki, and Ulki is kind of just the unit that I think most people think Janaff is. There is theoretically an argument for moving him down to bad filler, but I don't think he's that bad. He does need either the demiband or a stone if he wants to be useful as combat, because he has sort of the weird gauge number. It's not completely empty, so he will fill up on, I believe, turn 3. But it's not full either, so not being active for those first couple of turns does definitely hurt his viability. Other than that, his stats are pretty close to Janaff's. I think that he's just Janaff, but worse, but, that's still good filler in my book. It's a flying filler, it's fine. Neither Janaff nor Ulki get access to Canto, which is unfortunate, but flight is flight, and we take what we can get. Next up is Devdan, who is really only good filler for one chapter, but it is a chapter that lasts for 4 maps, so I think I give him some credit for that. He joins just before Chapter 17, and Chapter 17 has quite a few deployment slots, and his stats are surprisingly capable for that point in the game. There are 2 maps where you're going to want a lot of combat units, that being the route map and the defense map, and then if you want to play the other 2 maps more quote-unquote honestly, instead of using flyers to skip, he'll be useful on them as well. His combat's not going to blow you out of the water, but he's good filler. If you want to use him longer than Chapter 17, he's still going to be alright. I personally would prefer the Hawks, but if you don't want to deal with Legoo's Gauge or have a plethora of leftover forged lances, you can hand them to him and have a good time. He is stuck on 7 movement because of infantry, but that's better than being stuck on major armor knight movement, and his bulk is not so much worse than your armor knights that he doesn't perform basically a similar role, but with 1 movement more. Next up is Geofery, and the only reason he is this low is because of his abysmal availability. Geofery is another pre-promoted paladin, which is a phenomenal class, and he probably has a role on every single team, especially if you haven't trained Makalov or one of the other 3 cavaliers. But he still joins incredibly late. He's first available on Chapter 25, Strange Lands, but this is not a good map to be a Cavalier in, and is arguably one where you might want to undeploy some of your trained Cavs for trained infantry instead. Obviously, the Flyers are also great on this map because they don't have to deal with any of the terrain penalties, but Cavs have it really bad, just getting extra terrain penalties and having to deal with the fact that it is a zigzaggy mountain map. After that, his performance is still pretty alright. I would say that he is very similar to Haar in that his combat stats are good, but you have people who are better at his job, and you really only deploy him if you have extra deployment slots to spare, which you probably do, unless you've hyper-invested in quite a few units. It is notable that he has a pretty high bow rank, so if you haven't trained Astrid, then he basically gets the good bows as his personal weapons, unless you gave bows to one of the other paladins, of course, just because there are not that many good bow units in this game. So that's always nice, but he joins with only 6 maps left, and one of those maps is really anti-paladin, so there's a limit to how high you can go when you miss so much of the game. It is somewhat worth noting that Geofery has access to Paragon, being the only unit in the game other than Astrid who has that. However, he joins incredibly late, so the potential for this is quite limited. You probably don't have anyone else to spend the BXP on, so you might as well pump it into him, and it does definitely give him stats efficiently, but he only has 6 chapters left, and even with Paragon, It's not like he's going to be speeding ahead of your other paladins, it just means that he catches up to them more efficiently. The reason that Paragon is so good on Astrid is it allows her to pull ahead of the competition. On Geofery, he's kind of already starting at a disadvantage with not that much time left to go, so Paragon makes it so that he's not quite as bad as he could be. The last unit that I have in D tier is Tauroneo. Tauroneo is a very strong, very bulky, pre-promoted general who has inherent resolve, the strongest skill in Path of Radiance, which, when you are at 50% or less HP, gives you more strength, more speed, and more skill. Resolve can actually cause Tauroneo to become something of a dodge tank in addition to a physical armor tank, which is very amusing to watch. It also helps him double enemies, which is very impressive for a general to do. Unfortunately, enemy quality in Path of Radiance is pretty low, so being as bulky and strong as Tauroneo is a little bit of overkill. Sure, he's not going to die if he's frontlining, but the same is true of the majority of your paladins and flyers. Even if they are not quite as bulky as him, they can take on a large number of enemies, even not accounting for soul, and still come out the other side just fine. Still, Tauroneo is going to be doing significant combat if you use him. The problem is, using him requires using a 6-move unit. Armor movement is still a pretty big weakness, and there are maps where you have to do a lot of moving. He's also pretty heavy, so it's hard to shove him unless you are using the Laguz shovers to do so, and it always feels bad to use your premium shove and smiters to shove and smite a general instead of shove and smite a mounted unit. So yeah, Tauroneo can't really climb any higher than the bottom of D tier. He's fun to use, and he is not going to be the incredibly weak armors or pre-promoted generals of the GBA era, but at the end of the day, he's just barely good enough to be good filler, and it's possible that my Tauroneo bias is the only thing that elevates him up here. I do think his combat is phenomenal, and it is worth trying out for that reason. He also joins early enough that he is filler for a significant number of chapters of the game, but at the end of the day, he is still a general, movement is still a problem, and it's hard to get him where he needs to go. Once he gets there, he will impress, but getting there is a problem. Next up, we have E tier, which I define as either bad filler or very occasional utility. And we're starting with a spicy one. I think Ike is sort of the definition of bad filler. He is force deployed every chapter, so he doesn't eat up a deployment slot, but the role that he's going to be filling combat-wise is very analogous to what a filler unit would be doing. He occasionally does some combat, occasionally gets some kills, but he's not too good at it. Like, his bulk is pretty pathetic. If you don't give him the early Seraph robe, he gets 2-rounded very early on. And he's stuck on swords, which are the worst weapon type in Path of Radiance. Arguably, bows are worse, but Ike doesn't have an enemy phase anyway, thanks to his weak bulk, so I would say that swords are worse for him, because it means he can't attack uncountered unless he is killing the enemy. It is a little bit worthwhile to feed him kills when you can, but I wouldn't go out of the way for it. People will point out the fact that Ike is the only person who can kill the final boss or the Black Knight because of Ragnell, but you can feed him bonus experience before the final map, and then he will do just fine. He does have those 2 maps of extreme utility with the Ragnell, but I don't think that's enough to salvage an entire game's worth of poor performance. He's very similar to Roy from the Binding Blade, in that he's a sword-locked lord who it sucks to have on the front lines, gives some important units a good support affinity, but at the end of the day just is not worth using thanks to his weak bulk, his lack of access to good weapons, until the very last point in the game. I would argue that Roy is actually better, because I'd rather be a support bot in the Binding Blade, when you can be a support bot from inside saddlebags, as well as Roy having access to the Rapier, which is 3x effective against Cavaliers and Armor Knights, as opposed to 2x effective, and incredibly accurate in a game where accuracy is at a premium. It is worth noting that Ike is the only character who can defeat the final boss, and his performance on Twisted Tower and Repatriation is top tier, but that's not enough to drag him out of the dregs of E tier, and you can honestly, not focus too much on training him, because you just bonus experience him before the final map, and then he'll be fine. You can feed him kills when he's unpromoted, and it is somewhat beneficial to do so. I don't find it hard to get him to level 20 before his story promotion, but it's not, like, optimal to go out of your way to train him. It's just nice to have a few extra stats. But he's going to be good enough, even if he's level 1 before promotion. Well, maybe not level 1, but, like, he'll naturally get to, like, 5, 6, 11, whatever level, and then you just bonus experience him when he's promoted right before he gets the Ragnell, and he'll be fine. Next up is Ilyana and Soren, and this is another pair of units that I want to talk about together, because I think that they are very similar to each other. They face all of the same mage problems that Callil has, but they require some amount of either babying to be trained or bonus experience in order to, get promoted or whatever. They are potential beneficiaries of the Chapter 8 bonus experience dump. However, I think that is better saved for Marcia. She is the best unit in the game. The payoff is you get a 1-2 range unit with pretty alright combat. Like, it's not phenomenal. It's probably going to be your best combat, but it would be really disappointing if a unit you got to level 18 in Chapter 8 is not your best combat. Ilyana is obviously going to have to wait 1 chapter for the BXP dump if you want to invest in her, but she requires less of it and less babying if she doesn't get the BXP dump, so I think that she is ever so slightly better as a result. Soren does have a couple of defense maps that he can be babied on. It's hard to baby Ilyana on 8 because she gets recruited so late, but you can baby Soren on 5 and baby Soren on 8 in order to feed him some kills, and then BXP the rest of the way. And, yeah, I guess it's, an alright use of, you're not really doing anything else with those turns, and there's not really that many other units to feed. You probably want to feed Oscar, but that's the only one who, really benefits for getting kills setting up for them, and depending on, how much investment you've given Oscar, he might not even need kills set up for him. That said, they're still stuck in Armor Knight and Mage movement. 5 move unpromoted is really sad, and 6 move promoted is still going to be you need to rescue drop and shove them to keep them on the front lines. It's also worth noting that, while they're really good offensively, their bulk is... it's not terrible. But for a unit that you just invested a bunch of bonus experience in, it is definitely lacking. Soren gets the Earth support bonus from an Ike support if you want, which is more avoid, but then you have 2 units in the front lines that, Ike in the front lines is not great, because he should not be seeing frontline combat. The avoid is not enough for Ike to be able to quote-unquote dodge tank, and he's locked to 1 range anyway, so he can't counter people, and even if he does counter people, he's not going to be doing enough damage to kill them. In general, I think an Ike support is really overstated in its value, just because the avoid is very nice, but it requires Ike to be on the front lines for you to make use of it, and I'd rather have an actual competent combat unit on the front lines. But Soren definitely does have that going for him. Long term, if you choose to hyper-invest in one, Soren is a better hyper-investment target. Notably, Ilyana and Soren can both get stabs when they promote, which is something Callil is lacking, and they will be better combat mages when they promote than Callil is, but I just don't think it's worth the investment. It's either a significant amount of babying or a significant amount of bonus experience, neither of which gives you a payoff that is, super, super worth it. The roll compression of Combat Unit and Staffer is undeniably nice, but I don't really think Staffer is a super great place to be. Riss and Mist are barely in C tier, and it's because of their early game staffing, and by the time that Ilyana and Soren have stabs, you're past the point where staffing is all that necessary, and they only get E-rank stabs on promotion, which means that they only have access to heal. They can't even use Mend, which, granted, their magic's going to be fine so that they don't really need to use Mend, but they can't use Physic, which is a big deal, and it takes them a lot of staff grinding to get to rescue. You can do it. You have to be a little bit conscious about when they're using staffs, but you can do it. But the payoff's just not really there. I'd rather use Riss as a rescue bot than bother training the mages, even though it's easier to get experience in the mages in, the battlefield. they require promotion earlier to get staves on time. Notably, if you do not give them any bonus experience, they're not going to promote until around chapter 16, 17-ish, at which point it's far too late for them to start staff grinding and get to rescue on time. Which is why I consider Riss to be the better rescue bot, just because he's able to staff grind without early promotion. After the mages, we have Volke, and this is a unit I think is somewhat overrated. He has Thief utility, and it seems on the surface like Path of Radiance Thief utility is going to be great, because you can steal unequipped weapons, and this includes physics staves, so Volke nets you a pretty good number of physics staves. And in addition to that, he is able to open doors and chests. Now, it costs 50 gold to open those doors and chests. I think people sometimes play this up a little bit much. The gold cost does not matter whatsoever. You get so much gold in Path of Radiance that you're never going to notice 50 gold. Sometimes on Maniac mode, you might run afoul of not having enough gold to open a chest, but in general, you've got enough to open everything that you need, even if you max forge as much as you possibly can on hard mode. The game just hands you gold. The only time when money is a problem is the first 2 chapters where you have access to the forging, and in those chapters you don't even have Volke, and when you get him is right after the first gold dump, so suddenly, like, now you've got enough gold for everything, and that includes the doors and chests. So the 50 gold doesn't matter. The thing that makes Volke not great is that Thief usually just isn't a great place to be. You get enough chest keys to open every single chest that has something you care about in the game. And you can also manipulate Thief AI, or not even manipulate, just like allow thieves to open chests and then kill them to get half of the things you don't care about. But there's a ton of chests that have low value items like Armor Slayers or the Miracle Scroll or Corrosion or the Stiletto, and you can just skip those, use chest keys to open all of the chests that you do actually want things from, like the Energy Drop or the Resolve Scroll or various things like that. Never deploy Volke, and you don't miss out on a single treasure you care about. And probably even treasures that you don't care about, because a lot of chests will just be opened by random thieves and you can just kill them to get the treasure anyway. So Volke doesn't really add anything in terms of chests. It's also worth noting that because weapons and items take up split inventory slots, you don't have to ditch a weapon to put a chest key on a competent combat unit. You can still have all 4 of your weapons and have a chest key in the item slot for a combat unit. So, like, even that isn't especially difficult. Yeah, you do have to make sure that the person you're sending to get a chest has a chest key, but you have to make sure to send Volke to get chests if you're doing that otherwise, and, like, I don't think that making sure that the person going for chests has a chest key is something that is a particularly difficult task. And you can also trade the chest keys around if you need to, which is something you can't do with Volke's ability to unlock chests. The big draw that people have is the ability to steal weapons and staves, but most enemies only have 1 weapon, and you can't steal equipped weapons, so there's not a lot that Volke can steal. There's a Laguz Slayer that you can steal on Blood Runs Red, Chapter 11. There's a couple of Killer Bows that you can steal in the late game, but other than that, it's usually steel weapons, which are infinitely purchasable in armories, and like I said, Path of Radiance is a game where money doesn't matter. And in this case, instead of helping Volke for the 50 gold cost, this hurts him because suddenly stealing steel weapons doesn't matter. Physics staves are notably something that Volke can steal and give you access to that you wouldn't otherwise, but staffing is not especially helpful in the mid to late game. Physics is definitely useful, but you get 2 of them without stealing using Volke, and I think that's all you will ever need throughout the game. It does allow you to be a little bit more liberal with their usage, but between the 2 physics, the Fortify and the Asherah staff that you all get for free, I don't think you actually need to steal any physics staves to get all the physics uses you want, especially since, like, staffers are not very, very helpful. You're probably only going to deploy 1, maybe 2 in the mid to late game, and units just don't need healing as often in Path of Radiance. It very much feels good to steal a bunch of stuff, and I love using Volke because it gives me the neuron activation for stealing items, but at the end of the day, it's just not terribly valuable. I will say that Volke is better at stealing things than Soth because his strength and speed are better, and so are the growths and caps because he's able to promote. This does also technically mean he has better combat, but knives are so bad that it's not noticeably better. It is more because strength and speed are the stats needed for stealing items. But yeah, Volke is just fine, but not great. Up next is Bastian, and Bastian is basically Callil if she joined much later. Bastian joins in Battlefield Reunion, and he is able to use Siege Tomes, which is nice utility, but you already have Callil able to do that, and if you care about a combat mage, then I'd rather raise Soren and Ileana than try to use Bastian, because they come online sooner than he joins, and will be better than him at the time that he joins. I also just don't think Combat Mage is a particularly good place to be. He does get a little bit of bonus points for the fact you don't have to train him, but it's really not that much. I don't really have that much to say about him. He also has Corrosion, which is the only skill that can potentially actually hurt you. I think people overstate how much it can hurt you, especially since you can take it off him after his join map. But theoretically, it can reduce the durability of a weapon that an enemy will drop, and then you have less durability with that weapon. Realistically, it's just not very useful. People try to meme with him by like using Siege Tomes to corrosion enemies' weapons, in particular against other Siege Tome users, which is funny, but I don't give him credit for the fact that it's funny, and it's not especially useful. He's just bad filler. And I guess, like, if Callil dies, he gets the Siege Tome utility. I don't consider Siege Tome to be a tactical thing, or to be a combat thing. I consider it to be a utility role, because it is really just long-distance chip. You're not killing things with Siege Tomes, but it's fine occasional utility. I don't think you ever really want two Siege Tomers outside of the map solo, and that is before Bastian joins, so, like, doesn't matter. Next up, we have this game's only Berserker, Largo, and while he is incredibly fun to use, I think that he's just kind of bad. He joins incredibly late and is deceptively frail. He has an incredibly fat HP stat, but a really low defense stat, so he's often getting 2-rounded on his join map, which is very sad for him. It is kind of a textbook demonstration of the fact that defense and res are much more important than HP when it comes to bulkiness, and if anything, the fat HP stat means that it's harder to heal him up. He's one of the few units who you're not going to be able to top off even with a high magic unit. Axes are a good weapon type, and that's good, and he's infantry who joins in a map that you actually want to be an infantry for. I'd always deploy him on Clash, because you have like a million deployment slots, but that doesn't really say much for him. Axes are good, his stats are fine, he just joins incredibly late, and there's just not much payoff to using him. Next up is Nasir and Enna. They are kind of this game's Gotos. They join you one map before the final map in Twisted Tower, and you get a kind of a choice. It's not exactly a choice. You get Nasir if you kill the Black Knight, and you get Enna if you retreat. Some people would argue that Enna is better because Enna is for if your Ike is not strong enough to kill the Black Knight, and Nasir is for if your Ike is strong enough to kill the Black Knight. I don't think that it terribly matters, but Nasir is technically better statistically. He has a better class, he gets better transformation bonuses, and he has overall better stats. Theoretically, you could hyper-invest in any of them with bonus experience. Notably, they are also able to defeat Ashnard, which only Ike and them can do. The Royals can as well, but the Royals don't show up on time for Phase 1, so you have to have either Nasir, Enna, or Ike defeat Ashnard. Enna and Nasir are both able to do so at base if you give them Wrath Resolve, which is how I was able to get through 0% growths. But other than that, like, there's not too much use for them. And if you're not playing in 0% growths, then there's no reason not to just hyper-invest bonus experience into Ike right before the final map, and then have him take on the Black Knight, because a hyper-invested Ike with Ragnell will be better at taking on Ashnard than a hyper-invested Nasir or Enna. Ike is just as capable of using Wrath Resolve to kill Ashnard as Enna and Nasir are. It doesn't really benefit them as a unit, but it's something they can do, and if for whatever reason you have given Wrath and Resolve to other units, then they can help Ike, because he's going to struggle to kill Ashnard without that skill combination. Next up is Ranulf. There's not too much to say about him. He's a Laguz who joins even later than Janaff and Ulki, so you are far into the point where Laguz problems have started to really show themselves. His gauge also isn't even as good as Lethe and Janaff's. It's better than Mordecai's because it doesn't start at 0, but he's still missing the first few turns, and that really hurts. I don't really think there's much reason to deploy him. You could theoretically give him the Demiband. If you care about Laguz combat, he's probably the best user of the Demiband, but I think the Demiband is much better suited to one of your smite bots, notably Mordecai for all of the reasons that I said earlier. Next up we have Elincia, and they finally found a way to make a flying staff user feel bad to use. She is only available for 3 maps: Clash, Moment of Fate, and Repatriation, and none of these maps have a huge benefit for flight. Theoretically, you could use flight to get into the well earlier for Repatriation, but I don't find it difficult to get my rescue bot into the well. So there's not really a scenario where Elincia's rescue is better than just a foot or horse-mounted rescue bot, depending on whether you used Riss, Mist, Ileana, or Sorin, or I guess Tormod for that role. Funny enough, the one map that she misses after her join, Twisted Tower, is the one where a flying Staffbot would actually be quite useful, as there is a line of trees that would be nice to be able to rescue Ike over so that he could go and seize the seize point faster. But unfortunately, for plot reasons, she's not allowed to join. It's actually kind of rude. She's not even in prep, so if you have items that you left on her, you just don't get them for that map. I'm not holding that against her, but it is an annoyance, and if you use her in Moment of Fate, you should keep in mind that you need to take items off of her so that you'll be able to use them in Twisted Tower, if you care about using them in Twisted Tower. Yeah, otherwise there's not too much to say about her. Her combat is garbage, and she's a game over condition, but I don't really hold that against her because you shouldn't be putting her into, like, combat areas anyway. She's just a utility unit, and a very bad one at that. The last member of E tier is Tibarn, the King of the Hawks, and he's in a weird situation. For those who are not aware, on hard mode, Ashnard actually has 2 health bars. After you kill him the first time, he self-revives, and then you get the option to summon one of the Laguz Royals, either Gifka, Tibarn, or Naysala, to come help you with the second health bar. Theoretically, they are helpful because they are one of only 3 units in your army that can damage Ashnard, but realistically, an Ike who's capable of killing Ashnard's first health bar is equally capable of killing Ashnard's second health bar, so they are extremely unnecessary. This is because the easiest way for you to defeat Ashnard is to put Wrath and Resolve on Ike, which results in Ike usually 1-rounding him. If you get unlucky, then maybe it's a 2-round, but generally speaking, Wrath Resolve is going to result in a 1-round. This means that Gifka is unable to reach Ashnard on time, as it takes him 2 or 3 turns to get there, but Tibarn is able to reach Ashnard. Naysala is also able to reach Ashnard, but Naysala's combat is worse than Tibarn's, so I give Tibarn the edge. I do think that being able to theoretically help out with the Ashnard kill is very occasional utility / bad filler category, but he is elevated slightly above the other royals as he is able to actually reach Ashnard and deal some amount of damage that you might care about. Notably, if you are not using Wrath Resolve on Ike, then maybe the rankings of the royals change. However, I do not think that there is any reason not to use Wrath Resolve on Ike. It is just the best way to kill Ashnard. So if you are not using Wrath Resolve on Ike, then you are playing in a way that is just sort of like favoritism, rule of cool, which is fine. Like, I love Great Aether, but I don't think we take into account quote-unquote suboptimal strategies when it comes to how we are evaluating these units. I think that if you are playing the game in a way that is trying to maximize your chances of success, Tibarn is going to be the most useful of the 3 royals, and it does elevate him up to bad filler tier. Alright, so F tier time, and I don't think there's any reason to use these units aside from favoritism, so we're going to speed run through them real quick. Braum and Nephany both join on Chapter 11, and they actually might see deployment in that chapter, which is why they're at the very top, because you have a lot of deployment slots for Chapter 11. Their combat's going to be pretty bad, Brahms will be slightly better because he's a little bit bulkier and actually has a good lance rank, whereas Nephany is stuck in E rank hell, but Brahms' bulk is not so much as to make up for Armor Knight movement, and you'd be really stretching it if you said that they contribute a lot even in that chapter, and then you're not deploying them after that unless it is for favoritism, which is fine because Path of Radiance is a pretty easy game. You can use whatever units you want. Speaking of units that you want to use, or maybe don't, Soth is even worse than just bad combat, because he has bad combat to the extent that he's usually going to be dealing 0 damage to everything. He does technically have Thief utility, but he joins after Volke and is worse than it. He needs a single point of strength to steal physics stabs, which is a 50% growth rate, so it's not unlikely to happen, but the fact that Volke steals them from base is... like, it kind of invalidates investing in Soth to steal from physics stabs, and I already think that stealing physics stabs is not a super good utility anyway. I don't really want to invest in another unit to do it worse. Notably as well, Soth is going to hit Thief caps, which means 20 speed is the max, so there are going to be some units that he simply cannot steal from because his bases and caps just won't ever reach there. Volke gets to promote to Assassin, which is supposed to make him better at combat, and I guess it kind of does, but what it really does is it makes him better at stealing because he can steal from faster enemies like late game sages. Zyhark is a very fast unit, so that's the natural segue there, but he's just another sword-locked unit in your army, and his combat isn't particularly great. He does join one chapter before the Raven chapter, and is able to use the Laguz Slayer, but isn't even able to one-shot the Laguz, and doesn't double them, so it doesn't really feel like he's worth deploying even for that. Again, he can technically do combat in chapter 11, but I like his combat less than Brahm and Nephany's, mostly because he's sword-locked, and also you have to recruit him on the map. He can use the Killing Edge, I guess, but so can other sword units, and being sword-locked is just not a great place to be in Path of Radiance, but it is at least better than being tome-locked, and Tormod is a mage who joins far too late to bother training him. He has Celerity, which theoretically is going to make up for some amount of the movement deficit, because it gives him +2 movement, so hey, as a mage he has promoted infantry movement, and as a sage he has unpromoted mounted movement, which is nice, I guess, but he joins so late that if you wanted to invest into a mage, you'd be better investing into Ilyana or Sorin. I really don't understand what they were trying to do with this unit. I guess training projects are fun, but it's not that his stats are particularly better than the other 2 mages, and being a mage in Tellius is already not a great place to be. The extra movement is really nice, but I guess Tormod is a demonstration that there are limits to how much extra movement can benefit a unit. Gifka and Nesala I talked about briefly with Tibarn, but Gifka has better combat than Tibarn, but just doesn't reach Ashnard on time, and Nesala reaches Ashnard on time, but has worse combat than either Gifka or Tibarn, so there's kind of just no reason for them to show up. That being said, I do want to note that the optimal strategy for Path of Radiance is to choose Gifka, not because you plan on using him, he's not very useful on the map, but because when he shows up, he has a couple of capped stats, and that allows you to use his transfer bonuses to give him +2 in Radiant Dawn if you're using transfer bonuses. So because Tibarn is so useless as a filler unit for one enemy, you probably would prefer to summon Gifka just for the transfer bonuses. That said, we're not evaluating transfer bonuses in terms of unit evaluation, so Tibarn actually gets to do stuff if you summon him, which is why he's rated higher. Speaking of units that are rated higher than perhaps they should be, I definitely have some favoritism for Rolf, but he is not a great unit. He is an archer at level 1 who joins on chapter 9 with abysmal stats. He has a personal bow, which is supposed to help make up for this and does make the training arc slightly easier, but he still has all of the problems that archers tend to have. He's unable to enemy phase and doesn't deal a lot of damage. The accuracy of bows is also much less called for in Path of Radiance because of the low enemy quality, and the chip damage he provides is less called for because of the low enemy quality. He is one of only 2 units who can use the longbow, as mounted units are unable to use the longbow, but, well, technically 3 if you want to promote Boyd. So yeah, Rolf, Boyd, and Shinon are the only people who can use the longbow, but I just don't think that's especially worth it. He is, however, in my opinion, better than Maya because at least he can do training by chipping at range and being uncountered. Maya is incapable of doing that. All of her attacks have to be from one range, which means that training her is more of a hassle. I think the payoff of a Swordmaster is slightly better than the payoff of a Sniper, but if you want to do the Swordmaster thing, you can do that with Zyhark or Stefan, and they are much easier to train in that respect. Speaking of Swordmasters, Lucia is my pick for the worst unit in the game, and that's because she shows up incredibly late in the worst class, or at least the worst Bjork class, Swordmaster. Her stats are absolutely abysmal. People love to compare her to Stefan because they're in the same class. Stefan joins many chapters earlier and has higher bases and growths in just about every stat. However, I think that also comparing Lucia to other units who join around her time, like Bastian and Largo, who are not even particularly stellar, but just have better stats than her around the board, kind of shows how horrible she is. Theoretically, she does more in an average playthrough than Maya does, because you probably deploy her in Clash because you have a ton of deployment slots, but at the very least, a trained Maya is going to be giving you more than a trained Lucia, and also you can do some, like, flunky combat in chapters 9 and 11 and maybe 12, which, yes, that's stretching it, but I much more value being a flunky at a point in the game when I have fewer units than an ultra flunky at a point in the game where I have a ton of units, because sometimes you just have enough flunkies to not deploy her in Clash. Anyway, that is my tier rank ordering for Path of Radiance. It's important to note that Path of Radiance is an incredibly easy game, so even if you want to use units who I've ranked in F or E or D or whatever, you are not going to be kneecapping yourself particularly hard. Like I said, no reason to use the F tier aside from favoritism, but that doesn't mean no reason to use them. Some of these characters are incredibly fun, either as a character or as a unit. The extra movement on a Sage on Tormod, for example, is a fan favorite. And I know that I personally love the 0-2 Still a Zero training arc story of Rolf and Mia, and am very sold on them as incredibly fun units to use. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you think about this tier list. Do you prefer this format or the one where I sort of drag them and evaluate them in order? Do you have any disagreements about my placings? Do you think anyone should be higher, should be lower, etc.? I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. Path of Radiance is a game that I would say I'm very familiar with. I've done a lot of runs and looked at a lot of numbers and stuff, but there's always room for discussion, and I'm curious what all y'all think. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff, and I will see y'all later. Bye-bye!